الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. حي على الفلاح.
None of the Hail Mary troops could move until coalition air forces had crippled Iraqi command, control, and communications. After that, Saddam Hussein would be blind to any movement of troops along the front. The problem was time. The air campaign was scheduled to start on January 17th and the ground offensive on February 25th. In just over 1 month, 270,000 troops and all of their supplies and equipment had to be moved up to 250 miles and be ready to fight. Navy and Marine Corps pilots, air crews, and support personnel joined in the most powerful and successful air assault in the history of modern warfare.
Yeah, I remember the first night, January 17th, when we heard about the first airstrikes. We had just actually gone to bed that night, and one of the girls came in our tent and said, they just announced on the radio they're just attacking. So I was like, girls, get your gas masks ready. And sure enough, 5-10 minutes later, the chemical alarms go off.
From H hour on January 17, when the air campaign began, until the end of offensive combat operations 43 days later, Navy and Marine aviators destroyed key targets and helped ensure the United States military and its coalition partners owned the skies over Kuwait and Iraq.
At that time, we also got to bear in mind that the numbers were such that they expected us to lose so many thousands of troops. We had no idea what capabilities Saddam had, and so we planned for the worst, and they were talking about every third helicopter getting knocked out of the sky, half the pilots being lost. And at the end of that, with all the chemical alarms and the fear that was present and everything going on, we had found out at the end of the day only one pilot had been lost, a Navy pilot.
Operating from 6 aircraft carriers, 2 large amphibious assault ships, various other amphibious ships, plus ground bases and makeshift airstrips ashore, Navy and Marine fixed and rotary wing aircraft were an integral part of the coalition air campaign. As the bombs began dropping on Baghdad, the massive movement of men and machines began. The field commanders used the shift as a practice run for the dash across the desert, moving units in order of attack.
So I was given command of 2 platoons, a tank platoon and a infantry platoon. But they had no personnel other than the mechanics that were currently just driving them from location to location. And they were volunteers from 1st Infantry Division and 4th Infantry Division. 15 guys became my tank crew. 11 Bravos showed up as combat replacements. As infantrymen, they were sent to us to crew the Bradleys, but they had never been on a Bradley in their life. So what my responsibility was to create crews, trained crews for the tanks, and to get some training for these 11 Bravos that had never been on a Bradley in their life. So that February the 11th, all of the personnel that would belong to my organization were on the ground. And that was it. So we had 2 weeks to really get all that done, because the ground war started February the 25th or 26th, if I recollect.
The movement continued 24 hours a day for more than 3 weeks. Desert roads that might normally see nothing but four-legged traffic looked like a Los Angeles freeway. When the shift was complete, intelligence indicated that all Iraqi eyes were still looking to the southeast. The coalition had completed one of the largest and longest transfers of men and equipment in military history without alerting Saddam or his army. During the weeks prior to G-Day, Marine units, including artillery, reconnaissance, and combined armed task forces, were busy disrupting Iraqi defensive positions. Marine artillery and Army multiple launch rocket systems, using Air Force airborne spotters as well as Marine forward and aerial observers and clandestine recon teams inside enemy territory, had enormous success with artillery raids and roving gun tactics. The deadline set by President Bush for Iraq to get out of Kuwait was expiring, and now Saddam had no eyes over the battlefield with which to observe the Allied strategy. On January 29, Iraqi forces attacked and occupied the lightly defended Saudi city of Al-Khafji with tanks and infantry. It was to be Iraq's only offensive of the war. Al-Khafji was a strategically important city immediately after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. The Iraqi reluctance to commit several armored divisions to the occupation and its subsequent use of Khafji as a launching pad into the initially lightly defended east of Saudi Arabia is considered by many academics a grave strategic error. Not only would Iraq have secured a majority of Middle Eastern oil supplies, but it would have found itself better able to threaten the subsequent U.S. deployment along superior defensive lines. The Iraqi offensive to take Al-Khafji began on the night of January 29th, when approximately 2,000 soldiers in several hundred armored fighting vehicles moved south. The Gulf War's first ground engagement was near Observation Post 4, built on the Al-Zaber police building. Elements of the Iraqi 6th Armored Brigade, ordered to take the heights above Al-Zaber, engaged coalition units at Al-Zaber. At 2000 hours, U.S. Marines at the observation post, who had noticed large groups of armored vehicles through their night vision devices, attempted to contact battalion headquarters, but received no response. Contact was established at 2030 hours, which prompted Task Force Shepard to respond to the threat. Coalition soldiers at Observation Post 4 opened fire on the Iraqi column, but this largely ineffective fire drew a heavy Iraqi response, which forced the company to retire south by order of its commanding officer. To cover the withdrawal, the company's platoon of LAV-25 and LAV-AT anti-tank variants moved to engage the Iraqi force. The platoon moved forward and soon opened fire on the Iraqi tanks with the LAV-25's autocannons. Their fire could not penetrate the tank's armor, but did disorient the tank commanders. Soon thereafter, a number of A-10 ground attack aircraft arrived, but found it difficult to pinpoint enemy targets, so began dropping flares to illuminate the zone. One of these flares landed on a friendly vehicle, and although the vehicle radioed in its position, it was hit by an AGM-65 Maverick air-to-ground missile that killed the entire crew, except for the driver. Following that incident, the company was withdrawn, and the remaining vehicles reorganized within another nearby company. With Observation Post 4 cleared, the Iraqi 6th Armored Brigade withdrew over the border to Al-Wafra under heavy fire from coalition aircraft. An additional Iraqi column crossed the Saudi border to the east, although still along the coast towards the city of Al-Khafji. Al-Khafji was occupied by approximately 0:30 on January 30th, trapping 2 6-man reconnaissance teams from the 1st Marine Division in the city. The teams occupied 2 apartment buildings in the southern sector of the city and called for artillery fire on their position to persuade the Iraqis to call off a search of the area. Distressed by the occupation of Al-Khafji, Saudi Commander General Khalid bin Sultan appealed to American General Norman Schwarzkopf for an immediate air campaign against Iraqi forces in and around the city. This was turned down, and it was instead decided that the city would be retaken by Arab forces. The task fell to the 2nd Saudi Arabian National Guard Brigade 7th Battalion, composed of Saudi infantry and 2 Qatari tank companies attached to the task force. These were supported by U.S. Army Special Forces and Marine reconnaissance personnel. The force moved out by 1700 hours. They met up with elements of the U.S. 3rd Marine Regiment south of Al-Khafji and were ordered to directly attack the city. The engagement of that night was to be the first battle the Qatari Army had seen in its entire history. A platoon of Iraqi T-55s attacked a Qatari tank company south of the city, leading to the destruction of 3 T-55s and the capture of a 4th Iraqi tank. Artillery support was provided by the 11th Marine Regiment. The attempt to retake the city was preceded by a 15-minute preparatory fire from U.S. Marine artillery. Meanwhile, 2nd Saudi Arabian National Guard Brigade's 5th Battalion moved north of Al-Khafji to block Iraqi reinforcements attempting to reach the city. The interdiction on the part of coalition aircraft, Marine artillery, Saudi and Qatari ground forces was having an effect on the occupying Iraqi troops. Referring to Saddam Hussein's naming of the ground engagement as the mother of all battles, Iraqi General Salah radioed in a request to withdraw, stating, "The mother was killing her children." Coalition aircraft continued to provide heavy support throughout the day and night. A veteran of the Iran-Iraq War later mentioned that coalition air power imposed more damage on his brigade in half an hour than it had sustained in 8 years of fighting against the Iranians. The Saudi and Qatari units renewed operations the following day, and the city was recaptured on February 1st, 1991. After Al-Khafji, the coalition's leadership began to sense that the Iraqi army was a hollow force, and it provided them with an impression of the degree of resistance they would face during the coalition's ground offensive that would begin 24 hours later. On the morning of February 24, Operation Sabre, the long-awaited coalition ground offensive, began. While the United States and its coalition partners unleashed General Schwarzkopf's Hail Mary, the Iraqis were convinced that the battle would be joined at the center of the defensive lines along the Saudi-Kuwait border and by amphibious assault. What the Iraqis could not realize was that the Allies had secretly moved 2 entire corps of American forces, supported by British and French divisions, far to the west, in one of the largest and swiftest battlefield troop movements in history.
When the ground war began, we were going to take the left hook into Iraq to the airfield. And what we had done from Saudi Arabia, I don't know if you've heard of the road march at the 1st Cav Division, the mechanized road march, which was, I forget how many miles, but it was like the biggest mechanized division move in history. It took us hours. I mean, we would traverse the gun over the back and swap the driver out with the loader so the loader could drive for a while. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, you'd refuel on the move.
This giant end run by more than 250,000 soldiers spread over several hundred miles moved deep into Iraqi territory from the Saudi border behind the Iraqi forces to deliver a fatal left hook. The flanking maneuver not only cut off all avenues of retreat north and west of Kuwait, it fulfilled Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Colin Powell's prediction that the coalition, specifically the American military, were going to cut off the head and kill the Iraqi army. As the end run began, the Marines were tasked with going for the jugular. After performing their own deception by shifting both Marine divisions some 40 to 50 miles northeast from their original staging area, the Marines stepped off into battle. The 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, each more than 18,000 strong, and the U.S. Army 1st Brigade, 2nd Armored Division, plunged into the attack.
I just remember crossing, going into the other country, and I'm watching the tanks firing. I'm watching artillery land around myself. I had one land approximately 20, 30 feet from my vehicle, and I mean, my vehicle was a 26-ton, again, armored personnel carrier. And I mean, when it hit, it shook us like I was in a little soda can. I mean, the troops below, the infantry below, they were all freaking and panicking. I had them pulling on my leg and all that.
On their way, the Marines had to cross 2 belts of minefields, 12-foot-high sand berms, barbed wire defenses, booby traps, and fire trenches, all the while under sporadic attack by Iraqi artillery. These impenetrable barriers were quickly breached by the Marine teams.
We were actually sitting at the border of Kuwait. They had, what they had done was built up a berm, they had used like, you call them bulldozers, and pushed up this big, like 10-foot wall of just dirt, like a big berm. And basically what they told us is when we go into Kuwait, we're going straight up the middle. Like you said, they did have some units that was going to come around and flank them. Our job was to just go straight up the front.
As the 2 Marine divisions advanced, 2 Saudi and Qatari task forces moved up Kuwait's east coast in a similar drive. The initial Marine advance was described by Schwarzkopf in his February 27th briefing as follows. It was a classic, absolutely classic military breaching of a very, very tough minefield, barbed wire, fire trench type barrier. They went through the first barrier like it was water. Then they brought both divisions streaming through that breach. Absolutely superb operation, a textbook, and I think it will be studied for many, many years to come as the way to do it.
It's one of the things where we've all worked together, so it worked out where, it was almost like a courtesy, if there's another vehicle coming, you let him go, and, and then he gets through, he's going back to his unit. Because the military, especially Marine Corps, is all about formation. You break formation only if you need to, and so, to get through the little area, once you got through, you get back in your formation where you're supposed to be and keep continuing forward, which is the time, like I said, when the artillery, the tanks started taking gunfire and we started taking fire, and we had, we drove past blown up tanks. You can drive by and you look down, you can see tanks smoking where they've been blown up. And again, it's one of them things where it's just surreal. You never really think about the fact that, something that could have been me. Somebody could have blew me up and I wouldn't have seen it coming. It would have been 1 second you're here and all of a sudden you're not.
Overhead, Cobras, Harriers, and intruders provided close air support as the Marines pushed forward, meeting occasional resistance. Marine aircraft attacked in waves as engineers continued to shoot line charges and drop bundles of plastic pipes near trenches so the blade tanks could form makeshift bridges. Even though the 1st Division Marines encountered artillery fire and a mechanized counterattack, their attack proved unstoppable. Most Iraqis had fought for only a few minutes before surrendering. Massive artillery and air support from Navy and Marine aircraft sparked a frenzy of surrender that at times slowed the progress of advancing Marine units.
That goes to President Bush. That goes to Bush.
In the POWs that we detained, there was no fight. Beat down, just wore out. A lot of them probably were fighting because they had to, not because they wanted to. It wasn't like a professional fighting force like us, where that's what we do professionally. So, they did hold their own in the vehicles they had for what they had, but, we gave them a significant pounding before the ground wars.
The 2nd Marine Division enjoyed equal success. with the Army's Tiger Brigade on the west flank, the 8th Marine Regiment to the east, and the 6th Marine Regiment in the center, the division kicked off its attack. Within hours, they too had breached both defensive belts. Facing enemy mortar and small arms fire, the 2nd Division drove into Kuwait and took more than 5,000 EPWs by the end of the first day. As Marines continued their attack, the sea-based arm of the Navy Marine Corps team continued to provide support. The battleships continued rapid, responsive gunfire on targets designated by Navy and Marine spotters on the ground and in the air. The amphibious task force in the Persian Gulf continued to demand difficult decisions from the Iraqi generals. Because of the threat of an amphibious landing and the uncertainty of where and when it would land, 10 divisions, totaling 80,000 men, stood motionless in defense of the Kuwait coastline. Troops that could have blocked ground forces circling the exposed Iraqi right flank. In addition, they garrisoned troops and equipment on Bubiyan and Failaka Islands, which command sea approaches to vital areas. On the second day of the ground war, both Marine divisions faced sporadic resistance as they pushed further into Kuwait. The real threat to the coalition's battle plan came from the burning oil.
I was approximately, I'd say 500 feet, maybe 1,000 feet behind the tanks when we actually, as far as the ground troops, I was there when the oil fires started. The oil fires is what I think really messed us up, as far as us on the ground. I remember, again, specifically one night, well, actually it was daytime, it was 12 noon, and it looked like it was 12 midnight. We couldn't see right in front of us. There was vehicles running into each other. You could just hear the radio. People, it was just so much confusion, and I'm sure that was what Saddam had in mind to do. And honestly, for about a day, it did work pretty well, because again, we were pounding him and doing our thing. But once the oil fire started, all the smoke where you really couldn't see anything, and we, being again our personnel carriers, we just had to stop. They just came out of the radio. Everybody just stop where you're at. Don't move. Don't do anything. And we just sat there for about 24 hours. It wasn't until the next day that the smoke kind of cleared and, the wind, I guess, adjusted. And we all came out and looked around, and our vehicles were almost nowhere near a formation. We were vehicles inches from hitting each other, didn't know it. It was just so much confusion. But again, I'm sure that's what he had in mind, was to confuse us. But we just, I guess someone made the command decision, look, he's trying to confuse us, let's stop, recuperate, and work things, get ourselves together and then continue. And it just so happened the next day the smoke had cleared, to where we could actually see. It was still a little smoky, but you can actually see. And just, it was just amazing how we had barely, dodged a bullet, pardon the pun, from, ramming each other, and, we almost took each other out. So.
They fought some intense battles along the way, and by the time Kuwait's international airport was secured on the 4th day of the ground war, the 2 Marine divisions had defeated an Iraqi force of 11 divisions.
When I talked to you all before, and you asked me what we were going to do if we had to go to war, and I told you we were going to kick ass, and that's exactly what we did.
At 0800 Persian Gulf time, February 28th, American forces ceased offensive combat operations by order of the President.
Actually, we halted before the airport. When we did the division move, we moved north through Saudi Arabia into Iraq and made the left hook and then stopped. The mission from Schwarzkopf basically told first team to finish it off and let's go home. And now I will say at that time, a lot of people were pretty disappointed, because by that time, everybody's pumped up, ready to go. And, we had no idea that they were going to call a ceasefire, that was just like, what? And it was pretty quick after that everything just settled down. And we got so far, you're right at the 10-yard line.
In 100 hours of offensive combat, the Marines and 1 Army brigade, supported by Navy, Marine, and coalition aircraft, destroyed or damaged 1,060 tanks, 608 artillery pieces, 5 frog launchers, and 2 Scud launchers, and captured more than 20,000 Iraqi soldiers.